Hi, it's Mike Stevenson here. Today we're going to talk about the next video in the series about Azure Integration Services and where to use each technology. Today we're going to talk about Logic App Standard and Logic App Consumption and look at the options about one versus the other, where you might use them together and how best to kind of structure your use of these two technologies. Now, to begin with, let's start with an elevator pitch of what are these technologies. So Microsoft talk about Logic App consumption as being multi-tenant Logic apps. So you have a single workflow which is deployed into an Azure resource group. You don't manage the compute or the service under the hood. You just manage the workflow itself. Now, the elevator pitch level of multi-tenant is really that you're one of many customers who have Logic apps running on the underlying platform, and you kind of share the resources that other people might also be using, but you're really focused about that one individual Logic app. Logic App Standard is basically a specific type of function app which gets deployed into an Azure resource group. That app then is a container which is holding multiple workflows. So that's the first kind of key differentiator at this kind of position and statement level. One's really a single workflow, the other's a container holding multiple workflows. Now, the Logic App Standard gets deployed onto an app service, so there's a specific flavor of app service, which is WS1, 2, or 3, and that's set up as an app service in Azure. You then deploy your Logic apps to it. You can also deploy to an ASC3, which is an app service environment, ASC version 3, which we'll talk a little bit about later on. The key thing with Logic App Standards, you don't manage the underlying compute, so it's the same as having a web app on an app service. Microsoft take care of the sort of underlying hardware. You manage the app service itself, and you manage the workflows. So this bit here, I guess, is the key differentiator. You're really managing the app, whereas in consumption, you're only managing the workflow. In standard, you still have to manage the workflow, but you have to do this extra bit here where you need to configure and tune and kind of manage that application to make sure it's healthy and it's performing for your needs. So let's think a little bit about terminology. Start with that repeating that bit about Microsoft's position as one being multi-tenant, which is consumption, the other being single tenant. Now, personally, I find these terms slightly confusing of what they mean, because when you also have an Azure AD tenant, which all of your Azure resources would be associated with. So that idea of multi-tenant and single tenant kind of relates to terms often used in, well, what was Azure AD but is now Entra. So you've got terms about single tenant and multi-tenant authentications, which mean a different thing really. But the idea here by multi-tenant means there's other people using the underlying compute, whereas here it's theoretically more, I guess the underlying hardware is probably used by other people's app services potentially, but the position it as being more single tenant. So I guess that's really, you've got your own plans and that kind of thing. So if we think of the simplest way to describe what is a Logic app, so here we've got the difference in what do you mean when you say the word Logic app between the two. So if you consider Logic app consumption and you say the word Logic app, you actually mean one individual workflow. Whereas if you're in Logic app standard world and you say Logic app, what you actually mean is a function app that contains multiple workflows. So the next question would be, what is a workflow? So in Logic app consumption, a workflow and a Logic app are really interchangeable. They mean the same thing. In Logic app standard, they mean different things. So a workflow would be one of multiple things inside this app that you've created. So there would basically be, 1, 2, 3, 10, however many workflows in that app. The containers, the app, The workflow is really your code that runs. Now, I find the naming, and I'm sure a lot of other people find the naming and the terminology confusing because they kind of mean different things depending on where you are. So I think the way I like to think of it is the brand is called Logic Apps. That counts for standard and consumption regardless. The Azure resource is really where the difference is. What do you mean by this Azure resource called a Logic App? So I like to think about Logic App consumption. The resource you would create in Azure is really a serverless workflow, whereas in standard, the resource you create in Azure is a Logic App. And then I think that in Logic App Standard, the workflow is the thing inside of the Logic App itself. So I would like to kind of have the terms really meaning Logic Apps as the brand. A Logic App is the actual Azure resource if you're creating your own app, and then the workflows are really the key bit. So you either have a serverless workflow, which is really on its own, or you have a workflow which is part of an app. And I think that's a little bit less confusing, hopefully. Okay, so let's think about target use cases. So let's talk about the things that are common for both. So both types of technology are really going to be looking at these two here. So we've got that system to system workflow and we've got process automation. Those are classic sort of integration team EAI type use cases that you would have done in BizTalk back in the day. You would be doing these in Logic Apps nowadays. Those are really easy. I think Logic App consumption also has other use cases for things like IT admin automation. So if you're wanting, if you're an IT admin and you want to do some automation of Azure to reduce your workload, it's common that you would use Logic App consumption. I don't think you would necessarily use Logic App Standard for a lot of these use cases because they tend to be just ad hoc interfaces, which we'll talk about a lot more. Um, we'll talk about that a lot more in the coming slides, but I think you would find it would cost quite a bit to create a Logic App Standard for something you don't use very often. Now, target users, integration developers are definitely applicable for both. So that person who's come probably from a BizTalk background, you're developing these system-to-system workflows, these business process automation solutions, you would be comfortable with both of these technologies. Now, I think application developers you would probably find come from one of two types. So application developers who build consumption logic apps have probably maybe been in a Dynamics or Power Platform solution build and they need a bit of integration to help it. They may be doing like an API or a custom web app and they just need a really simple logic app where they can trigger something in their application or do a little bit of API orchestration. Those are the ones I tend to find for consumption. The different ones I think we'll see were standard, and I would argue at this point in time it's probably not a huge target user right now because they probably haven't discovered Logic App Standard as much as they're familiar with consumption. But I think we'll start seeing these people building sort of API backends a little bit with Logic App Standard where you need that enterprise application connectivity and you can just get away from writing custom code and you can use some kind of workflow, especially with things like stateless workflows. I think that'll become a new use case we'll see more in the future in the Logic App space. We also have IT admins. This one really links back to that use case up there. A lot of IT admins build Logic apps because they just help them automate the job that they do on Azure. It's kind of a bit like how a business user might use Power Automate to automate their own work. But because you're inside Azure, doing it with a Logic app opens up a lot of things like managed identities and that kind of thing. I'm going to skip over the bottom. I think the bottom row I used covered in the previous slide, so I must have juggled that slide around a bit. Now, What we're going to talk through the next few slides is different perspectives on Logic App Standard and consumption. So this particular video is a little bit different to some of the other ones I've done. I want to deep dive a bit lower down. And we'll look at the persona of a developer, DevOps person, and a few other things. And I think this will give us a really rich comparison of the two types of Logic Apps. So let's start with developer. So if you're a developer for Logic App consumption, you probably depending on when you started and how you started, there's really these three different ways you can develop. So people originally started in the portal. There was a few people built tools to help you extract and get the data into a code base so you could put it in a code repo and do DevOps processes with it. So a lot of people have done portal development. A lot of people also do Visual Studio 2019 development for Logic Apps. And then a year or two ago, they supported VS Code as well, and you do get some people who do that. The key thing that's common for both types of Logic Apps is you've got this visual designer, which is one of the key value propositions for Logic Apps, is that you're really offering a designer to let you build a solution rather than write an extensive custom code. Now, if you're doing Logic Apps Standard, the big difference is you don't have VS 2019. You're much more likely to use VS Code. You might still do portal development, but I think the big difference is that I haven't really seen a lot of people talking about writing in the portal and then extracting into VS Code. I think people would be much more likely to just either do it completely in VS Code if it's a professional solution where you want a DevOps experience, and then you're probably using the portal for some kind of demo or proof of concept where you're not really worried about those sort of application lifecycle management features. So as a developer, the next thing's about connectors. So we need to understand that we've got a subtle difference in the connectors between standard and consumption. So consumption and standard both have support for cloud connectors. So this is where there's an Azure resource that allows you to connect to an external system. An example might be a Dropbox connector, a Dataverse connector, something like that. So your workflow reaches out to an API resource on Azure that forwards your call with a third-party system. So those connectors can be built by Microsoft. They can be built by ISVs who would deploy their own connectors that other people can use. The big difference, though, is there's built-in connectors. So this is where Logic Apps Standard offers this connector that runs on your compute running the workflow. And then that'll run almost like an inline connector, I think is the easiest way to think of it. So this leverages leverages Azure Functions bindings. So things like a service bus binding would be a good example where you connect from that from the host running the workflow, use that binding, and you can talk to the resource. The benefits there are you can leverage the security of the app itself, so you can leverage the managed identity for it. You can leverage the networking. So if you've got your Logic app on a VNet, the built-in connector can leverage the VNet that the Logic app's using. You can't really do that with Logic app consumption. Now, from a developer perspective, the pain points, there's some differences here. So one of my personal ones that I don't like is we like to use managed service identities where we can because it makes life easier. In Visual Studio 2019 for consumption, it definitely works. We do it all the time, but the designer doesn't. There's a little bit of a bug where it sort of says there's an error, but it's not really an error. You can just ignore it. So that's one of my little annoyances in VS 2019. Consumption doesn't have support for local testing. You're on an older version of Visual Studio, so it doesn't support VS 2022 yet. It's only 2019, and also there are a few limitations performance-wise in VS 2019. So that's some of the challenges that you have with Logic App development in Logic App consumption. I think this is kind of one of the reasons why we still have people do portal development with Logic App consumptions, because of those, particularly those performance limitations. If you've got a really big, complicated Logic App, sometimes they can be quite sluggish and frustrating for a developer. And actually, being really quite honest, it should have been sorted out quite a while ago by Microsoft, that one as well. Um, I think actually saying that, mind, that one of the limitations as well is not necessarily the Logic app issue, but it was actually a Visual Studio issue, if I remember right, about how it uses a browser and those controls, and I think it was like an old IE thing. So I think the idea was at some point they would update that and leverage some of the Visual Studio improvements, which would improve Logic apps. So hopefully that'll come along at some point. Logic Apps standards. So the first thing is you're in VS Code. Now, this is something a lot of integration developers are less familiar with than some other types of .NET developers, because we've not all, web development's often ahead of integration development in terms of tooling and stuff like that. Um, there's definitely a bit of a learning curve challenge there, but also VS Code is simpler but also more problematic. So there's been a lot of problems with Logic App Standard where things like extensions updating have then broken your code a few times. I think that's become a lot more stable more recently, but in the past, if you look at the Git repo, you'll see some of the support cases have been about updates in VS Code causing problems for people. So local testing, as a developer, you can do local testing with with Logic App Standard that you can't do with Logic App Consumption. However, there are some limitations about it that I think you need to be aware of. So it's not well, certainly at this point in time, it's not a magic. You have a fully really rich, can do everything local test experience. As long as you're within the limitations, you can do some good stuff. But I think in the real world, you'll find you hit those limits sooner than you would like. We do occasionally get some weird VS Code errors and designer errors. Managed service identity has a few challenges with connectors. So particularly I'll probably do a separate video about this actually. There's some changes around how you go from having a connector that you use when you develop in VS Code to when you deploy it. And once you know how it works, you can get it working fine. But I think it's a little bit it's not that intuitive. But these are just maturity things where over time, I'm sure that a lot of these things will go away as people get used to them and the product enhances. To me, one of the biggest challenges was being confident. So Logic App Standard's been out for a few years now. There's been people changes at Microsoft over those few years and pivots on a few things. And I think at the minute there's a big drive around encouraging BizTalk customers to move to Azure, which has seen a lot of innovation around Logic App Standard. But if you look at the Git repo, you'll see that there was quite a bit of frustration for those early adopters of Logic App Standard around a few things. And I think that confidence piece, to me, while there are challenges with Logic App Consumption, I think it's very well understood what the workarounds are and that kind of thing. Whereas I think Logic App Standard is still finding its feet a little bit in that space. So if you're working with it, you get used to it. But I think you're back earlier in that learning curve, generally for most people. So I guess I've mentioned the good things here. The workarounds much more in consumption. I think the great thing about Logic App Standard, they're doing loads of innovation. So I really like this. They're doing lots of cool new features. Enhancements, inline code. I would certainly argue that with Logic App Consumption, we're not seeing the equivalent innovation. The main reason for that is because they've got a lot that they want to do with standard, and they've only got so many people who can work on it, and it makes more sense to focus on standard because Logic App Consumption does a job, it's mature, it's well used, well understood. It makes more sense to invest the money they're doing in standard right now. So architecture-wise, we compare a few things. So first up, complexity. I would argue that Logic App consumption is much simpler than Logic App Standard. However, Logic App Standard can be a lot more powerful than Logic App consumption. There's a lot of nuances to that, which we'll talk about through the rest of the talk. But if you simply look at complexity, that's what it boils down to for me. Runtime wise, so Microsoft take care of almost all of the runtime from an architecture perspective. All I do is deploy my workflow and then it runs for me. With standard, so it runs in the function runtime in an app that I configure on Azure, and I have to worry about the performance, the configuration, and the tuning of that runtime. So this is a big difference. You need to know how to manage that runtime and do a lot more work that Microsoft do for you in consumption. Networking, so again, some big differences here. So in terms of networking, we have a public endpoint on consumption. We can firewall it. We can put some security for authentication, but that endpoint is public. Outbound, so that's the inbound calls into your Logic app. Outbound, we have options for the data gateway if we want to go on premise. It only applies to certain connectors. You're comfortable making public outbound calls, that's straightforward enough. There are a lot of limitations around connectivity to a private network. You've already got the gateway, but Logic App consumption is much more focused around public endpoints. Now, if you do have to do a hybrid scenario, there are options. So one's the gateway. A lot of people use API management if you need to go on premise and that kind of thing. But you don't have that network connectivity piece that you will have with Logic App Standard. So here on the right with Logic App Standard, we've got a few big features that we can leverage. So because it's on an app service, we have, in addition to the firewall, we also have private endpoint capability, so we can take away that public endpoint so that your entire app would be only private, which is good for a lot of companies. We also have the app service capability for VNet integration for all outbound traffic, so you can basically make a Logic App Standard completely private, which you just can't do with consumption. Scalability is the next one. So Microsoft manage everything to do with the scalability pretty much from the platform compute runtime perspective. I don't really have a lot of visibility of that. However, I do have a few dials, not many, but there are a couple of dials around things like throttling for the connectors, and also there's a high throughput option on the Logic app, which will give you sort of better throughput if you need it. But Microsoft are doing most of the work here for me. When we talk about scalability, we'll come back to that multi-tenant idea where we're on a shared compute platform, so you've got noisy neighbors to worry about more with consumption. You also, if you wanted to shard for scalability, you could have multiple Logic apps that could share load. Maybe you do a competing consumer from Service Bus and you have 2 or 3 Logic apps process the data, might be an option. But you're really taking care of a lot of that hard work there, and you're designing it to suit that scenario. With Logic Apps Standards, so it's a bit different here. So the you manage the hosting plans. This scaling of the host is something you do yourself. So this is where, if you're on, say, a WS2 plan, you can scale up to a WS3 and you've got twice the compute, twice the memory. That's just not something you can do with consumption at all. You don't really have any concept of how much CPU or memory or storage or anything you have, whereas you do with standard. So you can scale up, you can also scale out. You've got the option, so you can have a fixed number of nodes. You've got options for things like elastic scaling based on performance, so you can have it burst out if you get extra load and scale back down. So that dynamic scaling is really controllable. Now, sharding's quite interesting with Logic App Standard. So deliberately mentioned it in consumption about as a design pattern where you might have multiple logic apps working together to effectively share out your load. It's kind of whether you really class that as shardens up for debate, I guess. But with standard, what's different is you've got a few extra things you can do. So you can do things like with this. So I think it was Rohit wrote a few articles about this kind of thing recently. So you can do things like sharden the storage accounts that are used by a logic app under the hood to increase the performance. You can have multiple instances of under the hood queues and kind of really tune that sort of. I guess we're touching on down here a little bit. This is the performance tuning area. So tuning how the runtime works to maximize performance from the available resources you had. So really, you've got a couple of options around sharding the internals of how the runtime processes your load. But you can then also have multiple hosting plans. You can have multiple apps within the same hosting plan, and you've got a number of different options of how you can design and tune that. Now, in terms of performance tuning, I think one of the things with consumption is it's not always clear to customers how much you can actually process on Logic App consumption. So I've really worked with customers who've done small to medium individual Logic App loads on consumption. I am aware of a few people who've done really significant volumes on Logic App consumption in terms of like like I guess the way we've typically had it is we might have a lot of messages in a day, but they're either spaced out or we've had bursts that we work through. But you do get a lot of customers who'll just constantly have significant numbers of data, numbers of messages processed and millions of messages a day. The volumes I've tended to work at have been more at these tens to hundreds of thousands of messages in a day, in patterns. So I think people expect consumption's much lower load, and I think you probably can get a lot more bang out of consumption than what you think. However, in terms of tuning, you do have cold start scenarios with consumption where they just run a bit slower. So I think we've seen this at times where when we did an ICE migration, we'd have certain logic apps that just individually take longer to run. I guess we can class it cold start. We can class it as part of noisy neighbor, whatever, however you want to class that. It's just that an individual logic app typically takes a little bit longer on consumption. With standard, we've got lots of tunings that we just don't have available. So we can have things like dedicated compute. We've got the ability to tune our host and our storage. We can tune the host.json files. So there's like tens, maybe 100 different settings you can potentially put in a host.json that would configure how your logic app's going to run. It's pretty complicated stuff when you start getting into that level as well. And you can tune it up, tune it down, control how different workflows would run and stuff. So you've got lots of knobs to tune there. Where really, I guess it's a little bit like if you're a BizTalk migration customer, there were so many different ways you could tune BizTalk to get the most out of it. That's really kind of what you have here. Availability. So I think this is quite an interesting one. So one of the innovations happening on consumption's the availability zone support. So that's quite a new thing. It means that you can have your consumption logic app across 3 data centers in a particular region or an availability zone, and it gets you better availability, even though it's a kind of a serverless resource that you're using and you don't really have sort of explicit control under the hood. Logic App Standard has this as well. It gets that by virtue of being part of an app service. So you have to configure on both of them. You're really just turning it on. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure of the proposed costs for the consumption one. I assume there must be a higher cost for it. With that being really new, the availability zones for Logic App Standard's been out for quite a while because it's part of an app service. Now there is a big cost difference for this. So if you're running one node of a WS2, for example, if you want availability zone support, really you have to be running 3 nodes concurrently to get the full availability zone support. So there would be a cost implication for that. Okay, DevOps. So I think this is one of the areas a lot of people will be interested in, is the differences between DevOps for consumption and standard. So we go through the different deployment options here. So we've got logic app consumption. So typically you're going to be using an ARM template. So you'll have resources defined in JSON as part of a JSON file which makes up your ARM template. Now, when you develop in Visual Studio, for example, really the designer just sits on top of that ARM template. So you would have logicapp.json would be the file. When you deploy it, you can supply parameters for the ARM deployment, and that's typically how it works. Now, you can also use Terraform there. I've done a couple of videos and blogs about that. I actually quite like that approach as well, if I'm really honest. But most people will be doing ARM template deployments. Conceptually, when you do your deployment, you would be deploying your code and the Azure resource together. So if we by code, what we mean is the workflow itself. So the Azure resource and the workflow go together. Now, Logic App Standard, it's different. So the code itself is really, your code's this app which contains workflow.json files. These get deployed in the same way that a function app gets deployed. So those workflows are really just a type of function. So you would have deployment of your app just like you would with a function. So you can deploy it from VS Code. You can do a zip deploy and all the stuff that an app service typically would support. But the key difference is that the code and the application infrastructure would typically be deployed separately. Now, that doesn't mean they can't be in the same solution, but it's really 2 deployments. So you would use something like Terraform or Bicep to configure the Logic app sort of resource in Azure and configure the settings on it. And then you would typically deploy the code or the workflows themselves as part of a function app type deployment where the code gets sent to that function app and it runs from there. So that's really where Logic App Standard's really 2 parts. Logic App Consumption's really 1. Now, configuration and parameters, there's some key differences here as well. So Logic App Consumption parameters, really, it's slightly confusing if I'm honest in a way, because there's 2 types. So we've got ARM parameters, which are for the deployment itself. And then we also have Logic App parameters. So Logic App parameters are things that live inside of the workflow that let you have a config setting that you can use at multiple stages in that workflow. An ARM parameter is something where in the deployment, you're going to give it a value that it would use in the deployment itself. Now, what you can do is you can say, this ARM parameter sets a value during the deployment of what value this Logic App parameter would have. So that's a really common pattern, but new people to Logic Apps often get slightly confused by the 2 types of parameters. With Key Vault, so a lot of people are going to want to use Key Vault to handle secrets. So with Logic App Consumption, you've got the option to look up at runtime a value from Key Vault. You've also got the ability, if you're using DevOps pipeline, you can inject Key Vault into the pipeline itself as a pipeline feature. They can then get set as part of your ARM deployment. You can also, a lot of people would be doing config settings. So if you imagine config settings and secrets are 2 slightly different things. So if you've just got, say, the URL for an endpoint, you may have that as a setting rather than a secret. And people would be deploying them into their ARM parameters either from app config or from a DevOps library as two of the most common things, but they would really be the things you would see in the pipeline used for deployment. Now, Logic App Standard, it still has these Logic App parameters, so these things in your workflow where you've got a setting that you can reuse. How the value of that parameter gets set during deployment and at runtime is different. So we said in Logic App Consumption you would set it from an ARM parameter. In Logic App Standard you would be setting it most likely from an app setting. So this is where you can deploy create the function app, the Logic App resource in Azure. You can configure the app settings, and then when the code spins up, those workflows will set their Logic App parameters by looking up the app setting value. Now, because that app setting is really part of the app service ecosystem, it gives us access to features like key vault reference. So this is a big difference. Over here, we could either, with key vault, we can either look up at runtime or we can inject secrets from the pipelines. But what we can do with standard is we can have this type of app setting that points to key vault and reads a key. So you can actually change the key in key vault and kind of have the app service pick that up and reconfigure your Logic app, which is quite a good feature, and it means you're not copying secrets around quite as much. That's definitely a good thing on standard. We also still have support for runtime lookups via the connector and app config lookups and that kind of thing. Now, one of the differences between the two is about connection management. So with Logic App Consumption, so you would be deploying a connection as part of the ARM template. So the chances are most likely you've got an ARM template with multiple Azure resources in it. One of them would be your workflow, one of them would be your connector, and the workflow uses the connector. Now you can have multiple connectors in that template, and you can have multiple workflows in the template as well, but they would tend to be configured together. Now, where it's different with standard is the connectors would usually be deployed. Certainly if it's a cloud connector, it would be deployed separately. So this is where we said before you'd configure your function app with Bicep or Terraform. You'd configure the connector at the same time, so it would be deployed separate to the code. When you do the code deployment, if you've got a built-in connector, then that kind of gets, you don't really deploy it, but it gets configured as part of the code deployment. But if it's a cloud connector, it needs to be done separate. So this is where, going right back to the start of the presentation, I was saying Logic App Standard just starts getting a bit more complex because of all the extra power you get to do advanced stuff. This is the separation kind of coming into play here. Now, when we deploy our cloud connector, we then want to reference that. So there's a couple of extra things we need to do. So the app needs to be aware of some settings where you would configure where the connection is, what settings it's going to use. That will be configured in your app settings. And then likewise, you also have to configure RBAC access for the connector. So if I've got my Logic App Standard app with a workflow talking to a cloud Dataverse connector, my app's managed identity needs access to that connector. So there are a couple of things you didn't need to do with Logic App Consumption. So some of the challenges here, then, if we look at the different ones, so parameterization for Logic App Consumption is probably the most challenging thing for a developer or a DevOps person, just because there's a lot of configurable things in Logic Apps. You instead of writing code, you're using workflows, but you need to configure all these parameters. So getting used to how to do that is probably the most challenging part of the learning curve. Once you're used to it, you're really just using the same techniques over and over again. So once you get past that curve, you'll be very productive. Logic App dependencies need to be managed. So things like in my ARM template, I've got a workflow, I've got a connector, and I've got a second workflow. If one calls the other, there needs to be a dependency order, so you would use a depends on setting in the ARM template. And then I guess the other thing, just referring back to the developer slide, because there's a couple of things like some of the performance challenges, you tend to find organizations, some may use the portal, some may use Visual Studio, um, some may use VS Code. You even have that in individual teams. So sometimes there's not the consistency that I would like to see in a company where you're using 2 or 3 different approaches to do the deployments, which just makes DevOps more complicated. So if you can standardize and use common approaches across your team, you'll find that makes life a lot easier. So Logic App Standard, the challenges, there's a few here as well. So connections and app relationships. So we talked about this in the last row on the table. So having that relationship in your DevOps process, knowing that I need to configure the connector, I need to configure RBAC for it, and it's separate to my code deployment. Just understanding how to do that and getting used to it's the challenge. Once you know, you're then productive with it. Pipelines for Logic App Standard are more complex than Logic App Consumption. Consumption's just an ARM deployment, so you can have 1 or 2 actions. Read key vault, do the ARM deployment, configure my ARM template. Maybe 3 actions is probably what a lot of pipelines need. But the Logic App Standard pipeline, just the code deployment would be quite simple because you can just use the function deployment where you would create a zip file from a folder and run it. But once you start doing the app configuration, then you're going to need bicep involved, you're going to need settings updates and that kind of thing. If you're doing any testing, then you've got .NET to think about. You've got that with both of them really, but again, I think it's just a bit more complex on Logic App Standard. Just to do a call out to one of my other resources at this point, if you want to know what a pipeline looks like, check out the Logic App test framework stuff I've done, where I've got an example of a really good pipeline in there doing everything you'll want to do. Logic App Standard, so that the app itself gives you a bunch of challenges. So with Logic App Consumption, you've really got one workflow. You may have 2. They're separate resources. You can create a really small deployment unit focused on very controllable dependencies. With a Logic App Standard, you would tend to have one app with more workflows in it. So that bigger deployment unit creates things that you need to think about when you're doing your deployment. So I think you'll find in the real world that bigger deployment unit means the chances are a Logic App Standard probably has more dependencies on external systems than a deployment pipeline for Logic App Consumption would do. So in that case, if I'm doing a deployment of Mike's app and I've only changed one workflow, but I'm redeploying everything, there's an argument that I should regression test everything, and maybe your automated tests will do some of that for you. Sometimes you'll have to do extra manual testing involving the systems as well. So there's some challenges because of the bigger deployment unit. You've got more to think about in terms of deploying. I guess with standard as well, the other thing to think about is about downtime during deployment. So I think with consumption, we've deployed over and over again, ongoing while things are running, and we've never really had a problem. About downtime, it just keeps running. The next message picks up the next version as soon as the deployment's finished. We've never had any problems where a Logic App's failed because it was running during a deployment. I think that's a really strong story for consumption. With standard, once you do a deployment, you're going to find that typically your app's going to recycle, so it'll respin up the runtime, respin up your workflows. There'll be a very small amount of downtime when that happens. You need to think about how you're going to handle that. So Microsoft don't take care of that for you. They kind of do with consumption. So you're going to have to either think about things like deployment slot type stuff, or about having an active passive or active active model where you can fully support zero downtime. You need to solve that problem. I think the wins, we've talked about these quite a lot during the slide, so I'll let people just have a quick look at them while I flip over to the next slide. So security, I guess, I've missed a couple of points on my slide here, but we'll just talk about them instead. So there's a number of areas we need to think about for security. So inbound networking, we've touched on a little bit earlier. So we've got firewall over here, where you've got a public resource, but you can control firewall rules to be able to access to call the logic app. You've got more advanced scenarios here where a logic app standard can be on a private endpoint. You can't do the firewall for logic app standards per app, whereas the firewall for consumptions per workflow, but it's really just on the resource itself. You're configuring IP access to it. Outbound networking, you've got the data gateway here on consumption. You've got private networking support on standard. Secrets, we've got, we mentioned this on the DevOps slide a little bit, we've got parameters and key vault connector. Here we've got the same things, but this one, that key vault reference is the big difference for secret support. That gives standard an additional feature consumption doesn't have. Authentication from your app or your workflow to connectors. So MSI is supported for consumption, but not necessarily for every connector. With the Logic App standard connector, so this is where it gets a bit more complicated. So you would usually, from your Logic App to the connector resource in Azure, you've got RBAC. So you've got MSI support for RBAC between the Logic App and the connector. And then from the connector to the target system, you've got MSI support in some places, and in other places you've got other authentication mechanisms. So that bit's very like consumption. Authentication to the workflow itself. So typically with standard, this is going to be configured on the app itself. You would configure, you've got options like easy auth and a few other things, but they would be configured on the app. You're leveraging really the stuff that comes with the fact that a Logic app's kind of just a function app, which is really just a web app. You get all the app service features for that. With consumption, authentication's really at the workflow level. So you've got a few subtle differences there. I guess with the keys, if you're not using any kind of Azure AD type authentication, I guess the URL for the workflow for standard, I'm not 100% sure off the top of my head actually if the standard URL, I mean obviously the path's going to be different for the workflows, but I'm not sure whether the secret would be different for each individual workflow. I'd have to check that, but certainly on consumption, if you weren't using Azure AD auth, the URL would have like a secret in it and stuff, and that would be different per workflow. The access controls. So here we've got some differences. If you want to have people set up to manage Logic apps and develop them in Azure, there's a set of consumption that have been out for years. They're pretty solid. They give you what you need. You don't really have those roles for Logic app standard yet. You can create your own roles, because the operations that you need are kind of there. They just haven't been rolled up into roles yet. So I've got an example on my blog where I created a custom role for testers, and that I could just assign certain Logic app permissions, and that kind of works okay. But it'd be nice if Microsoft took that a bit further. I guess run history. I can't remember what I was going to say about that, but I obviously was going to say something. So I'll apologise that's not filled out. I guess the key difference really is that the run history is in standards in the app, and you don't really have these custom roles yet. Whereas you'd have more custom role support for consumption. More out of the box role support for consumption. And I guess the other things, maybe the secure can't remember what the name of the feature is now, the secure input and output, where you can control certain actions. You can't access the run history. So that's available on both types. So that's the same. And I guess there's certain things you can configure in Azure policy around data loss protection and governance control, and what kind of things you can deploy in that. I certainly think advanced capabilities, because it leverages the Office 365 ecosystem in that DLP area. But there are policy controls around certain things to do with logic apps. It would probably be a really good topic, maybe to blog about a bit. And I encourage, if other people are using policy to do certain controls on logic apps, definitely I guess that's an area people don't talk enough about. Okay, operations. So run history, if you're a support operator. So with consumption, dead easy to use. You can configure it so that you've got certain lengths of duration that run history is kept for. So we've got a couple of interfaces. We lower that right down, others we increase it. Logic App Standard's pretty much the same. I would argue that maybe it's not as user friendly because it just performs a bit slower. I've tended to find it's just a little bit more sluggish. I think my gut feel is that's because it's part of the app itself. Maybe, I don't know. It'd be good to get somebody like Wagner's opinion on just perceived performance differences there, maybe. But I just, as a personal thing, I feel I always find the portal for Azure Logic App Standard just runs a bit slower when I'm looking at those run histories. For operations, so if you're using out-of-the-box login, you can turn on the ability for your Logic App consumption logs to be sent via a diagnostic feed to something like Log Analytics. You can also do custom things like event hubs and stuff like that. But usually it goes into Log Analytics, and you can write queries over those logs. With standard, you've got App Insights support, and then App Insights can write data into Log Analytics as well. So there's a bit of a difference between the two here. We'll probably dig into this a bit more later on, and I've done other videos in the past about these kind of things if you want to know much lower level detail. But I guess just understand that there is a difference from an operation perspective about how you can mine stuff. I guess probably one thing to mention here is at the Integrate Summit in 2023, the Microsoft product team made announcements about some of their business activity monitoring work they're doing, where it'll leverage some of this App Insights capability. So go and check the videos out and the blogs about Integrate 2023 if you want to know more about that. There are third-party products as well in that space, so if you want to do additional stuff, products like Serverless 360 you can log into to get more login stuff related to Logic Apps. But I guess the final one key for operations is the metrics. So on Logic App Standard, Logic App Consumption, you've got per workflow metrics for things like how many actions failed, runs started, runs failed. There's lots of really good metrics you can build dashboards with, and you can see the performance of your workflow. With Logic App Standard, it's different. I would argue it's better and worse at the same time, just in different ways. I know that sounds unusual, but if you let me explain. So the metrics for Logic Apps are per Logic App rather than per workflow. So what that really means is that I can go into a consumption Logic App, and let's say I want to go, how many runs have there been today? I can get a metric that tells me exactly that for that one workflow. If I go to Logic App Standard and do how many runs, that would be all of the workflows in that app. So it means a different thing. Now, to get the details on the individual, so really the metrics tell me about the performance of aggregated workflows at app level. I also get that under the hood metrics for things like CPU and other things that relate to the app service if I want to tune my app. But the per workflow stuff, I really need to be mining into App Insights logs to get more into that, and I think that just gets more difficult to do. Next up, we've got pricing. So if we think fundamental difference in price is logic app consumption, you would pay per action or per trigger execution. So an example of a trigger execution would be if you've got a logic app that checks for messages on service bus, you would pay every time that trigger checks for a message on service bus, you would be paying a tiny cost for that. Now, even if it doesn't actually get a message, the fact that it's a sort of polling trigger, it would be checking, that would incur a tiny cost. So logic app consumption is pure pay as you go, based on how much it gets used. Logic app standard's different, so if you're using the ASC or you're using the WS 1 to 3 plans, you're paying per node per hour, so you're paying based on CPU. So WS1 has, I think it's one CPU on WS1 if I remember right, so you're going to be paying an amount per hour while that CPU is active. So if you scale up to a WS2, you go from 1 to 2 cores. So you're going to double the cost basically. And those plans, they'll have specific amounts of memory, specific number of cores available. With Logic App Standard, so if you take the plan cost, you don't really have an option to scale to 0, so you'll always be paying a minimum of that single node, which, depending on which size plan you have, that could be between 1 and 4 cores. But you can, with the burst scale options on Logic App Standard, so you can let it burst scale out. You would pay per hour for those additional nodes, and then when it scales back in, you would your cost would reduce back down. So one of the interesting bits, I just paused the video for a second there when I was thinking about this per hour sort of billing bit here, is I'm going to take a question away to check with Kent on this, and check with Kent and Wagner around this. Excuse me. So I'm going to take a question away to check around this pay per hour billing. I'm just talking about the dynamic scaling there. So I've got a feeling one of the function premium plans offers per second billing. I'm going to check that. So if you imagine a scenario where your Logic app has a burst of load, you scale out to like 10 nodes that are all running a WS3, but within 5 minutes your load's processed and you scale back down again. The question is really, do you pay for the full hour or do you pay for the increments of the hour? That's going to be a question I'll take away, and I'll maybe just blog about that. I've had a quick look at the documentation. It doesn't really cover that. It's sort of really saying per hour. But I'm sure I'm going to have a look, because I'm sure a function plan offers a slightly different thing on that. But the next thing about pricing, so we've got the Logic apps are based around consumption. Logic App Standard is based around per hour, based on the number of cores that you have. Both types, when they're using the API connectors, which are the cloud connector type, so you've got additional costs when you consume those actions, whether it be standard or premium. There's a small cost which is based around the per action model. So even if you have a Logic App Standard, let's say you're using the Dataverse connector, then in that case you could incur additional costs beyond the per hour because you're calling out to the Dataverse. Now, to be fair though, the point there is that cost's relevant whether you're consumption or standard. It's really more on standard. You've got those built-in connectors would leverage, would just be part of your per hour cost. Now, with both types of Logic apps, there are additional costs. With consumption, you've got log analytics. So if you have log analytics diagnostics turned on for your consumption Logic apps, then you'll be paying costs for the storage and the transactions for log analytics. If you have an integration account, then you maybe got some maps or some EDI stuff, then you're going to be paying additional costs for the integration account. Both of those are optional, so Even though you can have log analytics integration, I've found a lot of the times you might turn that on for troubleshooting with consumption, and you maybe wouldn't have it on all the time. You can turn it on and off on a per logic app basis, which is really cool because it does log quite a lot of data, so it's not always something you want necessarily all the time. And again, integration accounts there only if you need it. Now, Logic App Standard, the first additional cost, the storage cost. So the chances are you're almost definitely going to be using the storage account. You will have costs for the content in that storage account, and you'll have costs for the transactions against that storage account. So the runtime in Logic Apps is going to be persistent state in the storage account. You'll pay storage costs for that. The chances are you're almost definitely going to be using App Insights with Logic Apps as well, on Logic Apps Standard. So you'll have costs for the ingestion of data into the App Insights. You may have sampling turned on, which may reduce the amount of data, but I think a lot of people are going to be using that login, so you need to be aware of those costs. You may also, just like consumption, you may have an integration account. So if you have to have maps or schemas that need to centrally live in an integration account, you'll have a cost for that. But with standard, you do have the option to have your maps and schemas just part of the code base for a given app, so you can still have maps and schemas but not have the integration account. You've got a couple of choices there. I guess the last one for standard is the SQL here. So there is support for having persisted state in SQL instead of in storage, which is mainly intended for customers who potentially want to have some kind of Logic App Standard on premise predominantly, but you could, I'm guessing you could do it with SQL Azure instead of Azure Storage, and you would have associated SQL costs with that. I'm not really that sure that I've seen a lot of people using that feature, but it's predominantly intended for people who may want to run Logic apps outside of Azure directly, with when you've got these Arc enabled services and that kind of thing. You might be looking at a SQL on-prem database or something as really the use case predominantly for that, but be aware that that might be an option for you. So next up, we're going to go through a couple of examples, and I want to show how cost calculation and cost comparison, you can do it with the Azure cost calculator, but it just gets way more complicated than that, and especially when you've got lots of interfaces. So we'll go through a couple of examples and talk about how they build up and really what this might mean for you. So we're going to start off with a very simple interface. See, this is our order processing interface. So if you notice, we've got a bunch of environments here. So we've got a dev, a build environment, system test, UAT, and production. This interface is a very small, simple interface, but it has a lot of business value. So we're processing really high value orders that might be in the tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands worth of value for an individual order, but we don't process that many of them. So I was looking at the scenario based of the real world one this is based on. So we're processing in the region of 0 to 130 messages per day, depending on the number of orders made. Sometimes we have, like, typically one customer might make multiple orders, but we do have days where there are 0 orders. Across a month, we'd probably have less than 500 orders in total. The Logic app that processes these, so let's just for argument's sake say there's 500 orders in a month. The Logic app that processes it is not that complicated a Logic app. We would have somewhere on a given day, we'd have somewhere between 0 and 1800 billable actions in a day, and it's driven by service bus. So we'd have a service bus polling trigger that might have 30,000 billable triggers per day. And this is just where it's checking for messages. So if we think about how that adds up, let's for argument's sake say we have 1800 actions per day. The cost for an action is 0.0000025 times 30, and that gives us a total cost for a month of less than $1. And we have, for the triggers, it would be $7.50. So if we think about that across all environments, we're talking about $8 per environment. Sorry, I'll just correct that. That figure, this 500 a month, is across all environments. So across all environments, we're talking $8 a month for the total cost of that interface across dev, build, system test, UAT, and prod. Now that may vary very slightly. If we're doing a bunch of testing, you might have additional costs, but it's going to be tiny. It's a really small interface, this one. We wouldn't have that many tests being done if there was a UAT going on anyway, because there's not that many scenarios, and it's not as if you're really extensively load testing when you get 500 messages a month. Logic App Standard, so in the same scenario, so we've got $8 a month running cost for all of our environments, but for Logic App Standard, the problem we have here is that we have to have one of two things. We either have to figure out a way to have shared plans where maybe dev, build, system test share a plan, and UAT and prod have their own dedicated ones. You have to think about how you're going to sort of do your deployment model there. Now, what typically people like to do, because it gives you that separation of environment, it's a little bit more expensive, but it would be really common that people would have one app service plan per environment. So for argument's sake, let's say we've got this. So we have a WS1 in dev, build, system test. We have a WS3 in UAT and prod. So that would in total give us a cost of approximately $2,000 a month for the Logic App Standard environments to support what would make sense for a setup here. Now, the obvious thing here straight away is that Logic App Standard for this one interface on its own doesn't make sense from a cost perspective. You're comparing $8 on the left with $2,000 on the right, so you would just never make that decision to spend $2,000 a month on this. But what we need to think about is that this is one interface out of hundreds potentially in a typical integration customer. So you've got to think about the cost for multiple other interfaces. Now, one of the decisions that, and I'm going to try and have some conversations in future videos with people from other companies where you've thought about similar decisions. One of the things we thought about was, well, it's perfectly fine to use consumption and standard at the same time. This is an example of an interface being that I would class as an ad hoc integration where it just runs every now and again. It doesn't make sense to put it on standard because that serverless on-demand equivalent of an Uber for, you get an Uber for as a taxi, you just call it when you need it. It's the same kind of scenario for integration, so we have it just run on demand. It's low load, low usage, $8 a month's great. We've got a lot of integrations. So let's say for argument's sake, we've got 500 integrations, maybe well in excess of 50% of them fit into this ad hoc model where they just run occasionally. They're very low cost, and we would just see this as being a good consumption candidate. Now, what we need to think about on the standard side, there's a couple of, like, let's say we were going to put it on standard. There's a couple of things here to think about. So number one, on a standard plan, there's a number of apps that would be able to run. Every app you deploy is going to have a footprint in terms of CPU usage, memory usage for polling the queues internally in storage to process messages. So the more apps you put on, even if they do nothing, they're still going to be doing work under the hood, even though you have zero workflows actually execute. So you need to think about that. Say we get one WS3, how many apps can it run before you start to need another WS3? So you'd have to scale it. And then you've got the problem of, even if you scale out, you really then just have two nodes that are doing the same amount of stuff. So maybe you end up needing more plans because there's only probably so many apps you can put on any one plan. So the scale and decisions that you need to make are really going to impact the overall costs significantly. So this is the reason why, for us, the ad hoc interfaces that are low cost, we try to keep them on consumption, because then we can allow us to use, where we do need a WS3 plan, we can keep that for the apps that would really benefit from having either the advanced features or the advanced tuning and deployment and performance, and keep the ad hoc ones separate. Okay, so that's one example there. So if we think about the running cost, then as we add in the second example, so here we've got a different logic app. We've got the same environment. This one processes data coming out of our plant into a certain system. So every morning we get a burst of about 30,000 messages come out. They get loaded into an end system. Now, here we've got the logic app for this. If it was on consumption, has 350,000 billable transactions per day and 40,000 billable triggers per day. It would be the same number of messages on Logic App Standard. Now, if you think of the cost here, so we think of the cost here, we've got 350,000 actions. We've got the cost per action. Then we times that by the number of 30 days for a standard month. So we end up with this Logic app costing $262 a month to process those actions. Again, that's across all environments. So what we would have here is production would be running that kind of load every day. UAT and system tests probably do nothing most days, but then sometimes when you're doing testing, you might replicate your production load, so you might have certain days where you double the amount of the costs. That's the thing about the consumption cost. You pay for what you use, but you also don't pay for what you don't use. So that's pros and cons there. Similar trigger activity here would be about $30 for the month. So we're saying in total we're looking at just under $300 to process all these messages for the month. As I say, that cost might go up quite a bit if we were doing a lot of testing. So let's say sometimes the monthly cost might be $500, but mostly it'll be around $300. So for argument's sake, let's say we had $292 here. The last interface was $8. So for argument's sake, let's say our total running cost for our integration platform on consumption at this point would be about $300. Now, if we were doing the equivalent in standard, we've got this 30,000 messages a day, but we've already got from the previous interface all of this set up. So we deploy this app on our existing plan, and then we shouldn't be using any more cost than what we're already paying. So that's one of the benefits of the plan-based cost, is that you can put more stuff on that plan and you just reuse what you've already got. You're getting more value out of that existing monthly cost that you're paying. So we see our consumption costs starting to creep up though. Okay, so this time we're looking at a new interface, which is our GPS interface. So we get these events from our rail cars telling us where they are and when they've been delivered, and we process these into our various systems. So here we've got the same environments, but this time we're getting 120,000 messages per day. The logic apps for this are fairly complicated, so we're looking at 2 million messages, 2 million billable transactions per day and 400,000 triggers to process these messages on logic app consumption. So we work that out as being about $1,500 a month for the cost of the actions, and about $220 a month for the triggers. So I'm going to just round that up and say the cost of this interface is going to be about $1,800 a month we're paying across all environments. Now, what we've got to remember is that, again, it's pay for what we use. So if we have a lot of UAT going on, we might end up, if we replicated a production day, that that in UAT, that might actually be quite a significant cost for this interface. So, let's say we did a month worth of UAT replicating production, this 1800 a day potentially doubles. At this point, we're looking now as a running cost for those three interfaces build up. We went from $8 to about 300, and now we're up to about 2,100 because of this interface here. So if we look at this on standard, the same messages a day, we should really be in a case where this plan we've already got should comfortably be just add this interface as another logic app on that plan. We shouldn't really have to pay any more money than what we're already paying. So the key thing here is this shows how, as we've built the interfaces up, we've built the platform, we're adding more logic apps, we've suddenly gone where consumption's overtaken our logic app standard cost, and suddenly this type of interface has meant our logic app consumption costs are quite expensive for one interface, whereas we saw with example number one, an individual interface could be really cheap as well. So this is where I think getting the best value for money for me is about combining the two. This GPS interface really makes sense to have on Logic App Standard because you just get better value for money. And especially when you combine it with a last interface, putting those two on that standard plan really would make sense, especially if you knew, if you go back to the previous example, if it was the only interface you were building, you could have done it either way. This time, this one 100% makes sense for standard, and it makes the decision of interface example 2 makes more sense to pick standard because you've already got the standard plan. And I think with the interface example 1, in my opinion, even though you've got the standard plan, it makes sense to keep that on consumption because it means the next interface that comes along, you'll potentially have the capacity on your standard plan to add it because you're not putting the low volume, simple interfaces that just run on an ad hoc basis. You're keeping them on the serverless plan. Okay, so things to think about when we look at price, and hopefully them examples gave a lot of food for thought. Now, extra costs are one of the examples that you might have to think about. So we've got maps and schemas. I mentioned this a little bit. For consumption, you have the integration account cost, which you could also have for standard, but standard has the option of an inline map, which can save you some money there. We talked about login. So with consumption, you'll have a log analytics workspace, but you don't have to have your login on all the time. You can just turn it on a per workflow basis. When you need to troubleshoot, it'll start capturing the logs and you can turn it off again. That'll significantly reduce your log analytics costs. And people who do a lot of logic apps consumption could find that the log analytics costs could become really significant. Standard, you've got app insights we mentioned. So there's a question about how you configure your sampling. Do you turn it on or off? I think most people will probably have it on for standard, whereas I think most people for consumption will probably have log analytics turned off by default. Would be my assumptions on that. Now, when you want to analyze your spend, coming at the next section, so this is where the Azure metrics for logic app consumption really help you, because on consumption you've got a per workflow cost metric, so you can build something like an Azure workbook to see individual logic apps and how much you spend in, and kind of track the usage on a per workflow basis. On Logic App Standard, those equivalent metrics are at the app level, so you can see which app's using the most money. But in order to be able to work out which workflow may be inefficient, this is where you really need that app insights data, and you'd have to mine and figure out where what's using the money. Now, the next thing's about the application services environments. This one's just not applicable for consumption, but on standard, We've talked about this WS3 plan a bit. Now, I guess one thing to say about the WS1 to 3 plans, in my opinion, from using them, the WS3 is the one that you were going to use in production. I looked at the option of we had an interface that was quite low usage, and we looked at could we use a WS1, but I think to me that's a dev plan. It just doesn't perform. I think the amount of effort to process all the storage transactions and stuff just made it really slow once you got any kind of production like load on it, even at really low production loads. So to me, I think WS3 is realistic for production. To me, WS1's development, WS2's potentially testing. But I think in the real world, most people are going to end up using WS3s. Happy for feedback off people from comments if they see that differently. Um, Now, I think when we come to compare WS3 and AS3, so here's the two kind of closest equivalent options. So you've got the 4-core, sorry, this should be 16 gig of RAM here, not one. So you can see basically you've got two similar machines. One's got 2 gig of RAM more. The price, there's about $100 a month in it, so $750 for the WS3, $850 for the ASEV3. Now, looking at the documentation, touching on the bottom one, you've got these reservations and saving plans. So, as an example, a 3-year reservation on an ASE3 would bring that 850 down to 450. So you can see it's significantly cheaper. The 1-year reservation's not as cheap, but it is cheaper than it is better, so it's like a 25% discount, I think, on the reserved instance. So, to me, one of the questions I'd quite like to take to the product team is why would you not just use an ASC V3? Why would you want a WS3 now? Because certainly, if you're going to commit, there's not much in it really in the pricing anyway. But if you're going to make a commitment, the ASC3 is definitely cheaper, but you get all the networking benefits that you can configure at the plan level rather than the app level. So I think to me that switches me towards an ASEV3. So really, if we think about the price and comparison now, so think about logic app consumption. So let's say we start at 0. As we start using logic apps, sorry, I'm stupid PowerPoint here. So we start using logic apps and our costs will go up like this as we're executing load, come down. And then as we add more interfaces, we should find that our costs are going to look something like this. We might even have a day where there's absolutely no load, would be realistic, and then the next day it might shoot up. And it's really, it's going to be completely demand based. It's going to be hard to predict because it depends on how you're using it, what interfaces you have. But the benefits are if you only have 1 or 2 interfaces and they don't really do that much and they don't process a lot of load, you might pay next to nothing. Whereas if you have lots of interfaces doing stuff all the time, you might have really unpredictable costs. So you've got both ends of an extreme spectrum there. Now, with let's see if I can get a different colour pen actually. So let's have a blue pen. So let's think if we're on Logic App standards, the first thing is we're not starting in this bottom corner down here. Let's say we've got 1 node, let's say it's a WS3, so we're going to start paying per month, we're paying this. Now, after 3 months, we might suddenly have to scale, so we've got a time where we go, right, we now need to go to 2 nodes, so we're going up here, and we've got this really predictable price. And now this is going to be easy for people to estimate cost and manage cost, but then you might have scenarios where we actually have elastic scale and turn on, so we might suddenly burst out and then come back to our predicted cost because we've had a peak of or a burst of load to process. Now, there's a couple of things about that elastic scaling, so it's good for cost because you just pay for that bit extra when you use it and go back to your default. You're going to have to think about how that affects your apps though, because if suddenly your apps are, you've got two compute nodes and you had been throttle and load, you might increase the amount of volume you're processing. So there's ways you can handle that through configuration, but it should be, this is the bit about you've got all these extra tuning knobs to think about. Now, you might then suddenly go, right, well, we've hit our max number of apps, or we're struggling to get the performance out of this one plan with two nodes on it because we've got a lot of apps on. So you might need to add a second app, and suddenly you've now got two apps, one with two nodes and one with one node. So you're going to get this, really this diagram here is about the pattern of costs. So really with standard, we'd expect to see a step pattern by default with occasional bursts, whereas with consumption, we'd expect it to be much more up and down based on the type of usage you get. And maybe over a long period of time, you'll see a regular pattern, but I think especially as you're building new stuff, it's going to be very volatile in terms of cost. Okay, next up we've got manage and change. So here we're thinking about, we're using a platform. We aren't fully in control of what the change rate of the platform is. So it's not just the code that we're building, it's the things Microsoft are doing. And I think for platform as a service, regardless of your vendor, that's a really important thing to think about. So let's talk about the changes. So consumption, the recent changes we've had, I'm going to go back to my red pen for a second. Recent changes we've had have been availability zones, have just come out pretty new. There hasn't really been a huge amount of change other than that on consumption for quite a while. It's been fairly static, it's fairly mature. We've talked earlier about some of the changes we'd like Microsoft to do, but generally it's been, it's in this point on the kind of hype cycle where it's plateau of productivity, so you're really just using it, you know how to be effective with it. There's not a huge amount of innovation needed at this point, but on standard there's loads going on. So we've got runtime 4 at the back end of last year, we've had designer changes multiple times, the visual map, we've had .NET support in a couple of places, API-M connector, app insights enhancement. So there's two sides to the argument. The positive side is we're getting lots of innovation, lots of good stuff, new things that'll help us build stuff. The trade-off is that can all affect us because we might have an app that's running that gets a break in change, or it might be something where it affects how our DevOps pipeline would work, or it might change Visual Studio. So we have to be aware of changes happening outside of our control. How do we manage if they affect us or not? So that's the opposite side of the kind of the risk with that change outside of our control. Now, in terms of what needs changing, so we've mentioned multiple times for consumption, the thing we really want is the Visual Studio support to just be better, fix the performance issues, make it really productive, bring it up to the latest version. Logic Apps Standard, I would argue that it's the balance between innovation and stability. So the innovation is all about addressing the feature gaps that BizTalk migration customers need. If you look at the issue list on GitHub, it's definitely improved a lot, because a while back there was people having regular problems. So I would argue there's been a huge improvement in the stability. Ideally, it would just continue the way that's going. And then we'd be in a really rock solid place. So the rate of change is the bit that I want to get across. So here, Logic App consumption slow and stable. For me, it's low risk when I implement something on consumption. My feeling is that Logic App Standard is fast and volatile because there's a lot going on. That makes me feel like I'm taking a little bit of a risk sometimes with standard, but I feel that's not as much of a risk as it used to be 6 months and a year ago, and I expect that risk to go down. But I think as of right now, I feel implementing on standards higher risk than implementing on consumption, and that's just one of the many factors that I would factor into deciding between the two. So the question next is, how do I decide? So here we've got a little bit of a diagram that I put together to help me make the decision. So really, if we think about, do I need outbound VNet integration? So if I do, I need to think about, well, can I get away with APIM or the data gateway, which would make it feasible that I could use consumption. So I could have my consumption talks to my APIM, it talks to an API in the network, assuming APIM is part of my architecture and is VNet integrated. If I don't have those options, then that immediately puts me down this have to use consumption. Sorry, have to use standard over here. Likewise, if I need inbound private endpoint, that puts me straight into standard. If I need low latency, so here I would say, things like if you're building an API backend where you need that stateless workflow, that immediately puts you to standard. If you're doing a BizTalk migration, now this is where I think this is on a workflow by workflow basis. If you need those BizTalk like features like inline code, the maps inline and that kind of thing, now maybe you can refactor, maybe you can have a consumption logic app that calls an Azure function or something like that. You've got choices, so it's not completely black and white. But if you feel that you are going to benefit from the things that they've been doing with Logic App Standard to help migrations, get straight over to standard. If the answer to all of these is no, the last one's about the number of runs. So hopefully the price bit says if you've got lots of runs and lots of actions, cost-wise you'll be better on standard. But if the answer to all of these is no, then you've got this decision down here between standard and consumption, where it really comes down to how do you feel about the technologies, what are your comfort zones around development, DevOps, is there any security things that would influence your decision a little bit? What are you doing with the other interfaces? What's your internal architecture strategy around this? This is really going to influence which way you get. But I think there's some low-hanging decision points that can push you to standard. And then if you get through all of them, then it's really about where what's best for your particular interfaces, I think. So we think of some of the example requirements that would underpin previous diagrams. So here we've got Logic App Standard. If you were thinking of a solution with durable functions, but you wanted that visual designer experience, you'd be looking at Logic App Standard. If you were thinking about an API backend that integrates with line of business systems, you would possibly think about Logic App Standard because you would get the benefits of the lower latency with things like stateless workflows, but still have the benefits of the enterprise connectivity via API connectors. If you want to integrate with an on-premise integration via non-API approaches, so not over HTTP, you probably would favor Logic App Standard because you've got a wider range of options through VNet integration, whereas consumption, you're really looking at the gateway, the data gateway. If you want those BizTalk-like features, so there's lots of stuff happening in Logic Apps that route for those more BizTalk-like features. If you're expecting high volume messages, the cost element is going to favor you towards Logic App Standard. If you need to tune performance a lot, so we saw earlier in the presentation, there's lots of options around low-level tuning for Logic App Standard that you don't really have for consumption, so you'll be able to get better performance, better throughput, and you'll be able to tune how you want to process stuff. And if you've got them complex networking requirements, those are all some of the things that would push you very much in the Logic App Standard place. Consumption for me, the biggest one is all of these ad hoc integrations where they don't run very often, they don't have big load, they're quite lightweight, and by low load and ad hoc, they can still be more than what you would expect. So maybe, we saw earlier an example of like 500 times a month. It costs next to nothing to run. even ones where you've got an integration that was, even if it was a couple of $100 a month for certain organizations, that still may be a really good consumption candidate depending on what other integrations you're building. So I think here you really need to think about your strategy, and not just on a one by one basis, but what is your entire integration platform going to look like. Consumption logic apps would be definitely one where if you're only really talking to cloud resources or public APIs, that's definitely in the game in that arena. And if you want to, really what it boils down to, if you want to keep it simple and let Microsoft do most of the work for you, then you're in consumption world. Anything you do with standard means you're going to be taking on more of the work yourself, but you get more of the benefits of doing that. So we're going to have a look at a couple of examples now. So in this case here, we're looking at that railcar GPS interfaces we were looking at earlier. So here we've got events come from our railcars. They actually come through a partner. So the railcar events come through a partner. They hit our API here, gets them into our environment. So we've got this receiver logic app that receives the message, does some stuff with it, puts it onto service bus, and triggers other interfaces. So we've got one of them fires, and it works out if a rail car's been delivered. We update one of our SQL databases to indicate the rail car's been delivered. All of the messages coming in would go through and be updated into Dataverse so that we can show a customer the current location of their rail car via the Dynamics portal. We also have a logic app that would process a message, and it would update our Synapse platform that would allow people in using Power BI to see reports and that kind of thing. So this integration, it's really the predominant factor here is about the volume of data. So if we only had a couple of rail cars, they had events where we've got data coming in at a volume where it wasn't going to cost a lot to run this on consumption, then consumption would be perfectly fine. We can integrate into Synapse, SQL Azure easily. All these bits tick boxes where technically it could be done either by consumption or by standard. The real big differentiator here is the volume of data and the cost to process it. And so if we thought earlier we had I think it was something like 120,000 messages a day coming in. There's quite a bit of work in each of these logic apps for an individual message to do stuff with them, transform the data. Particularly things like Dataverse, you're having to look up a bunch of different reference data and that kind of thing. So it's just the amount of effort to process the data and the volume meant that the cost was high for doing it. So this is really where cost was the influencing factor for this one about why to choose standard versus consumption. So in the next integration, we had a one that's at a high level, it's not really that dissimilar. We had events coming out of success factors about people, updates to their employee records and that kind of thing. We pub sub them through Service Bus, and we basically plug and play all of these interfaces like this one here from Service Bus that'll integrate person updates into different systems. So we've got a new hire would be integrated into Active Directory. Every time there's an update, we update things like Oracle, SAP, Salesforce, SQL database, etc. Now, if we think about some of the technology pieces here, so we have the ability from Logic App, we actually use an Azure function to call into Active Directory. We have enterprise connectors to talk, well, certainly for SAP and Oracle. Salesforce can be HTTP based, and this can be SQL connector, and it could be via a data gateway if we need to go on premise. So there's a bunch of stuff going on here. The only real technical challenge is the hybrid bit here. So we already have a function app which is network integrated, so we can put C# code in there to talk to Active Directory. and that can do updates via that way. So here we've got no technical blockers really. That means we have to use standard versus consumption. If we didn't have that function app, maybe there was an argument that this one here was standard for the networking, but it doesn't mean that necessarily all the others would have to be standard. These are separate interfaces, they're separate solutions, they could be different technologies. If we wanted, it would be entirely feasible that we could have said that could be a function app instead of being a logic app, would be doable. Now, when it comes to our architecture decisions here, for us, this was a no-brainer to be consumption driven by the fact that we have so few updates coming out. We like on a standard day we might get like 20 or 30 tops. Even if we updated everybody, there's only probably about 1,000, maybe 2,000 records. So this is really in that ad hoc interface space where it's a good candidate for consumption. Let's, for argument's sake, say this one, we talked about the function app here. Let's say we needed the network connectivity for this one. I probably would have only put that on standard and left the rest on consumption, because if I want to change this one here, I wouldn't have wanted to have to worry about redeploying all of this and all of the retesting and that kind of thing. Especially with ad hoc interfaces, you might find they might not change for 6 months. And, if you think about in your test environment, something might be going on a different project for SAP. They don't have the chance to support the testing you need to do for a change up here. So being able to treat these as micro interfaces on logic app consumption is a big win. We may have put that on standard just because of that networking piece, but for me, for our given scenario, this was all consumption and it worked really well. Next up, we've got a combo here. So one of the examples might be we need to get access to an SFTP site over here that's on-prem. Excuse me. So we've got an SFTP site, the T in there. We're going to write a file from different places. Now, what we could do, the first thing is the logic app consumption has an SFTP connector, but it doesn't support the on-prem data gateway. So that gives us a challenge about how to connect to that SFTP site. So with Logic App Standard, we've got the built-in connector here. And that'll allow us to talk to an FTP site that's on the virtual network. You don't have that option with Logic App Consumption. The data gateway is not supported for the cloud connector. So if we want to connect to that SFTP site, if we're over here and we're in standard, that's dead easy. We would just really have the same scenario as that. But what we can do, if we had Logic App Consumption, a good design pattern might be that you have a standard logic app, you sit API management in front of it, your consumption logic app can call your standard logic app through API management, and you kind of treat this a bit like an API where you just ended up with a file written to SFTP, or you could read a file or vice versa. Now that to me is about, you're treating the logic app standard a bit like an adapter. So you may build up a library where you've got other logic apps for other adapter-like scenarios, and that would mean your ad hoc integrations can call through to the SFTP site, and you're just building an API layer on top of some of these on-prem assets. Now, that would be kind of the same as if you're in Power Automate world. Your Power Automate's not going to be able to hit that SFTP site either. So this is where your library of logic app standards that are lightweight, simple, just support the network connectivity, can be opened up to be used by other logic apps, other Power Automate. They can be used by Data Factory potentially if you don't have an on-prem an on-prem runtime or something like that. And I think you can kind of get the best of both worlds a little bit there. So to me, the scenario might be it wouldn't be worth having this logic app standard because it just runs once a day. It does one job that takes 30 seconds. It just doesn't have the connectivity. But this logic app could be used to write files to multiple different folders for the 10 different interfaces that you might be building that need it. So that's kind of leveraging the best of standard and consumption together. Thank you very much for listening to this video. I know this has been quite a long video. I wanted to try and deep dive as much as I can around all the different things you might be thinking about when you're comparing standard and consumption. I think at a really high level, there's things that are obvious to think about, but if you sort of lift the covers, look under the hood at some of those decisions, there's definitely a lot of factors that affect whether you would choose one versus the other. I think I've expressed this in the video a few times. I think my preference is to use both because they have slightly different target scenarios that they would be best in, and I think you'll get better value for money of your integration platform. I'll try and do some follow-up videos chatting to a few people and just talk about different organizations that might have made slightly different decisions to what I've talked about here, what their experience was, what the pros and cons were. And I think it really just comes down to there's a number of tools in the toolkit. If we think back to the original video, you've got all those different tools. Where do you use functions? Where do you use logic apps, etc.? And I think it's about the right ones for your use cases. Thank you for listening.